Hello, everyone, and welcome to Sip and Scholar, a podcast where we uncork new knowledge. Today, I am with the amazing Erika Abad, Dr. Erika Abad, who has the most patience with me. I appreciate you a lot. And she is an amazing colega, an activist, an artist, a writer. I mean, I can use all my fingers to talk about all the amazing things you are. And what I like the most about her is that we're both Puerto Ricanas. And
I know, it's my favorite thing.
That's how we bonded, our shared culture and heritage. And I'm super excited to have you here because every time that we've gone to a bar and we have some conversations, I've been very just surprised about the work that you're doing with the community, the work that you're doing with our students, and just you're an amazing scholar. So it's always really good to have you. And we've also both share a passion for trying new spirits. So today we're trying Puerto Rican rum from Jayuya. And it has a lot of cinnamon undertones. I think it's pretty good. And you mentioned that your grandfather?
My grandfather was born and raised in Arecibo, and I think they make Palo Viejo where he's from.
Oh, wow. I don't think we can find Palo Viejo in the States, right? No. That's a Puerto Rican thing.
Yes.
But can we find Donku? Donku está Ponce, ¿verdad?
Yo creo que sí.
Yeah. I don't think we can
Yo
find
no sé mucho de ron, aunque soy boricua, pero forgive me.
No. Anyways, this is excellent. So we're going to be sipping on this as we talk. Now, the first questions that I had for Dr. Abad is talking about community-based participatory research. Every time that we've gotten together, she talks about what this is, what she's doing in this line of work, and then I remember thinking, damn, I don't really know much about this, and I haven't been engaged in it, so I'm very happy to talk to you about this. So the first question that I think a lot of us are going to have, because, this is a big term, community-based participatory research. So what is this? What is it composed of?
Okay. When we talk about it, I usually tell stories, so I'm going to try to balance the story with a working definition and context, and a soundbite, because there's a lot that can be said because there are books, and I haven't read all of them. So community-based participatory research can be a type of form of ethnography or qualitative research. Mm-hmm. The purpose of the research is to decenter the normative higher ed academic authority, and work in partnership with community leaders of the organizations or institutions that you're working with. In the tradition that I was both informally and formally trained, community-based participatory research is an anti-racist and arguably anti-colonial research mm-hmm. intervention that seeks to sustain and respect the authority and the autonomy of the community organizations and the marginalized populations which we serve. Boom.
Yeah, and I think what you're mentioning right now is one of the reasons why I don't think I learned a lot about that in a PhD program, right? And what you're looking at me like, oh, makes sense, right? Because it's really centering your experience, centering your work, and you're putting yourself as part of that research, right? Mm-hmm. Which we are often told not to do.
Yes.
Right? We are observers, we're not participants when we're doing research.
Yes.
That's a colonial way of looking at research too.
Yes, right? I just taught the colonial gaze in my women in media class. So I love that you say we're just there to observe. Mm-hmm. And one of the things scholars of color and other radical scholars, right, and global South scholars doing research at home or in diaspora are aware of is that so often, right, and this connects to art perfectly, mm-hmm. Individuals come in that don't look like us, take our knowledge, our resources, our histories, our epistemologies, our ways of knowing, take it back home, oftentimes either leaving us worse off than we were when they arrived, or taking ownership over ideas that weren't theirs to begin with, right?
Yeah.
And in this way, my community-based work with artists of color here in Vegas, and what I learned are are complementary to each other. And that was the conversation I had with Justin Favela when I followed him and was taking notes during the preparation for the Family Fiesta. I had just written about for NYU's Latinx Projects Interventions blog, in that, you know, I met Justin in 2018 when I worked at UNLV. And from there, he featured me on podcasts, allowed me to interview people on his podcast, Art People podcast, on top of consistently introducing me to other folks. And then right in the middle, at the end of 2020, after a very exhausting breakup, after an otherwise crappy year, there he is with his truck, like helping me move a third of my 3-bedroom apartment into a 1-bedroom apartment, right?
Yeah.
And so here's this artist who I met who's like, this is how much I cost. And I was like, understood, this is how I'm not going to bring you to campus unless I can pay you this much. And 4 years, at the time, 2 years later, he's helping me move. I was like, this is a guy I can't get rid of. He's awesome. And I tell him that often. And so when I was in Arkansas, I was and this week when we were working on an installation he's doing here, I said, he's one of the most important relationships I've built here because of the networks he shared with me, and also because his artistic practice, right, complements how I learned how to do community-based work. You build relationships, you ask people what they need, right? You think about your capacity and you find common ground.
Yeah.
And as I've learned to tell people here, I haven't always been a scholar, right? You said the 10 fingers.
Yeah.
I've done youth organizing, voter registration, door knocking, community gardening. What am I missing? Grant writing, right? Directed a policy advocacy campaign, helped run a neighborhood farmers market.
You just published an article.
Right? I just published the essay on Justin,
the
and then I wrote an essay for Justin's book, and now I've added curator to the mix. On top of all of these things, I've interviewed actors at lesbian fan conventions, right? And I'm 40. But all of this work ties together in that when I was thinking about colleges after high school, I wanted to stay home because I had gone, thanks to a full ride, to a 4-year East Coast boarding school. And so when I land at DePaul University, surrounded by Latino professors, I'm in heaven. And so, and what was beautiful about the professors I worked with, right, because by my second year I'd be a research assistant, is that they were making doing community-based work in relationship to their research and teaching look like a walk in the park. And so that was my normal, right? And so the first year I worked, I was a Latino studies major. I worked in their office as a publicity assistant, learned about McNair, met Ana Castillo, Achi Ovejas, and Juno Diaz on my first year. I was like, oh my God. And I'm an aspiring Latino, still closeted writer. What? Yes, please, thank you.
That's amazing.
Dude, I was like Mecca, right? Oh my God, like Ana Castillo was my professor. Anyway, but by my junior year. So by my sophomore year, I decide, because I'm still trying to figure out what I want to do with my career, right? And professional development is the thing. So I go from being publicity assistant to Latino studies to being a peer mentor for the Office of Multicultural Student Affairs. But then there's this professor in another college at DePaul who's looking for a research assistant to do research on cultural identity and displacement in Puerto Rican Chicago. Her name's Marix Alicia. And I was trying to write a novel at the time because I was still thinking creative writing was the path I was going to go, and the universe has jokes. Entonces, so for a year and a half, I videotaped her while she was doing interviews. We rode in cars. We drove a lot together reflecting on identity and gender and work. And so her community-based participatory research was, right, sociologist, qualitative study scholar, is she was teaching an oral history class at a component of the Juan Antonio Corredhead Puerto Rican Culture Center that was called Family Learning Center at the time. That was then renamed Lolita Lebron Family Learning Center in 2004. And they asked me with 2 minutes to read a poem in front of Lolita Lebron. I was like, what? What is...
That's an awesome opportunity, though.
Listen, like, in the moment, I was like, this is obnoxious. And I made one up and I published it and I won an award for the Center for Latino Research's poetry contract, which was like dope, but it was also like, this is intense, right? Because Lolita Lebron is in the room, and you've got to think of a poem, and you're like, oh my god, like, what am I doing? But this is like the answer to my prayers in high school and all the isolation of structural racism, but like also, Lolita Lebron, I have to watch. Elder, please don't tell me. And I'm thinking, please don't tell my mother because she's gonna, or my grandmother, because they're gonna have concerns because we don't agree politically on Puerto Rico status.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I'm deeply involved thanks to Marixa opening the door and me walking through, and other DePaul University classmates already involved and engaged with some of the other Puerto Rican college student organizers at the time, right? And so my first exposure to community-based participatory research was, if we're going to document the lived struggles and experiences of the community leaders who dedicate their lives to building institutions so that we can be respected, affirmed, and celebrated, right? And who are working to support our housing rights, our civil rights, etc., what is our responsibility to respect them, to continue to do the work, while also holding them accountable to limitations, right? That emerge because someone can only do so much, and
we're only human,
and we're all human beings.
Yeah.
And power and inequities are totally a pain in the ass. And so I'm still closeted. I'm coming to terms with, like, not just the political divisions with my family of origin, but the perceptions of emotional support, right? And for me, it was about, and this is literally coming back full circle, where what is the role of intergenerational trauma and community-based activism and collaboration when you don't have the time to go to therapy?
Yeah.
Right? Or you don't have the resources. We'll get there. Give me a second. And so my first foray into community-based research was thinking about these questions of social responsibility. The Juan Antonio Corredhead Puerto Rican Culture Center at the time was co-founded by a group of a dozen women and men, some of whom were still Puerto Rican political prisoners, right? And so looking back, I can say that the anxiety of surveillance, the toll of family separation in terms of standing up for your rights, factors into how elders mentored us, and also in how we collaborated with each other, and how we understood it. Oftentimes, I had an understanding of boundaries before boundaries were sexy. Not a lot of college students who are living in the neighborhood, doing the community organizing school and working and grant writing 24/7, right, necessarily appreciated those boundaries. If I would talk about them now, they'd probably be like, we messed up, right? And so when I was doing my McNair research, wanting to focus on Debate Urbano, which was the youth collective I was a part of my junior and half of my senior year, I hiccuped because I was trying to, like, do the expectations of the work and do the community organizing and making the breakfast and helping with the breakfast fundraisers and figuring out the plan and trying to help, like, give them information to write a grant and getting an understanding of what it meant to join the collective, and going to New York and trying to organize this multi-college youth contingent, and not trying to organize, following the people who were trying to organize a multi-campus contingent, advocating for more Latino faculty on campus, right? I don't know how they slept. I know I slept. I know I did. I don't know that these men and women who were living in the neighborhood actually, I don't know how they got through it. And so I ended up leaving the Bate Collective because I was exhausted and disillusioned, and because in hindsight I recognized the internal work I was doing didn't align with the values of the people at the time. And so it was a hard decision to make, but it was a necessary one, because I was still working. I was 21, so I was 5 years into my Me Too work. And I was 5 years into it with a foundation of a plethora of resources, thanks to my high school, right? That had rearranged my schedule so I could go to the women's shelter and work on art for 2 hours a day, right? And that my senior year gave me a community support group. And so fast forward, right, and the connection here is I've added curator to my tricks, is that over over 200 cards in response to the art show I had curated, Two Cultures, One Family, the toll of intergenerational trauma came out in spades. And so, and then I'm doing workshops with students around these cards, because I'm saying, if all of these strangers are giving me parts of their hearts, the dialogue needs to continue, especially in light of Roe versus Wade being repealed, the ridiculous cost of housing, right? Yeah. Right? You regulate our wages, but you won't regulate the cost of housing, and you expect us to afford to live in Vegas. That's adorable. Or anywhere, really, right? And the Supreme Court justices are like, we want people to build families. I'm like, on what? We don't have universal health care, and minimum wage is not a living wage. Thanks for nothing. Am I done? I'm not done. So I'm thinking about these things in conversation with my art show, in conversation with how, right, Spanish speakers, Tagalog speakers, among other multilingual people, are reflecting on being either children of immigrants, people in diaspora, people away from home, trying to make meaning of their lives. And I connect it back to my community-based research intervention, because one of the things I realized, especially when I came back to Chicago in 2014 and fired for the first time in my life, a week later, emailing Alejandro Molina, who was the marketing director of the campaign, among other hats he wore for the Puerto Rican Cultural Center. I walk in after critiquing them in my first peer-reviewed article, La Voz de Quien, and I was like, so I see there's a job that's looking for an oral historian and archivist in Chicago. I'm jobless. And Alejandro's like, don't worry, I'll talk to Jose, we'll figure it out. By the end of the day, I'm there. I haven't seen Jose in years. Jose's like, yeah, telling the then director of the Center for Puerto Rican Studies, yeah, hire her, and I have a job the next day.
Oh, that's awesome.
And that, for me, right, is important to say for a couple of reasons. One, that first paper they had a meeting with, and they only told me in 2016, and that paper was published in 2009. And two, because my long-term goal, especially when the economic recession hit and I came out and I was like, why am I here, was we need to start saving Oscar's letters. I had started writing him in 2004. I wrote him until 2016, because then he was out of prison, and then he got busy and I got busy with a full-time job.
So can you tell us who Oscar is?
Yes, of course. See, I talk Puerto Rican and I forget. So Oscar Lopez Rivera was the longest serving former Puerto Rican political prisoner who was arrested in the early 80s for sedition. In addition to being arrested for sedition, prior to, he was a Vietnam vet who advocated for housing and civil rights and equal access to education. A lot of his grassroots work, right, like laid the foundations for a lot of the housing and education rights organizations in Puerto Rican and Latino Chicago. While he was in prison, he was in solitary for a year. He has been in some of the worst prisons in the U.S. In the U.S. Talk about community-based participatory action research intervention. The week after Pulse, because I was transcribing the letters that he sent to Alejandro Molina, I am typing about the first time he got his handcuff released while people are organizing vigils for Pulse, and all I think is, right, and this is 2 days after standing up in the National Puerto Rican Parade with veteran Puerto Rican activists who were also a part of Oscar's campaign, right? And I was like, I'm not grieving with anyone, because I was marching with queer Puerto Rican elders the morning after, and y'all got nothing on that energy. Nothing, especially when Oscar's still in prison. We're worried about the implications of all of this terror language around queer Latinos and Puerto Ricans in Florida that could potentially affect Oscar. So when Oscar's liberated and he goes to Puerto Rico and goes to the memorial, right? I'm getting chills as I'm telling you. I'm like, he understood the assignment. This is especially powerful because, going back to Marixa, she interviewed his baby sister, who talks about living a double life, right, in her oral history, and who talks about, because she performs straightness and identifies as queer, right? And so this entire trajectory of my life is informed by wanting to come back home, thinking critically about colonial legacies on community building and family, all at the same time, like coming to terms with the implications of how so many activists are stretched too thin, are sometimes putting their work over their humanity. And given the Me Too work I had started to do, and that I'm still doing because it's a lifelong process, right? How do we balance all of that? And when I think about why I decided to do workshops with student leaders, and I've done them for Nepantla, 2 for Nepantla, 1 for McNair, right? How do we continue to talk about wanting to do the most for our families and our communities and being exhausted because of it? And not just because the living wage is a horrible, housing isn't regulated, but more because we're dealing with all of this and we still have dreams.
Yeah.
I'm a PhD because I wanted a full-time job with insurance that allowed me time to write. I now write at the rate that I want, and I'm like, what do I write about now that I have time? And I'm 40, and I dedicated my life to doing good community work because of the elders who came before me.
Yeah.
Because when I'm questioning why I'm in higher ed, and when I see us consistently needing to subscribe to Western logics, like to the point where my committee, which was all Latino at one point, was like, you do have to read all of these white folks if you want to get a job. I was like, but why?
Yeah.
Why can't I have an all Puerto Rican dissertation with maybe some South Asians, indigenous, and Black feminist thought? Like, why do I need anybody else? Right? And so now I'm in this place where Vegas is the place I've lived the longest. Vegas Valley is the place I've lived the longest after Chicago. When I came to Vegas, I said, they love the fact that I want to do Oscar work, because I was like, you're going to call me an escapist like you did for grad school, but let's be clear, no one on the East Coast wants to give me a job for Oscar, but the West Coast does. And then with Alejandro Molina, who's Chicano, I was like, isn't it funny? You're Chicano working with Puerto Ricans, and every time I do work, Mexicans and Chicanos hire me.
Yeah.
It's a joke between us. But yeah.
Okay, so the next question that I have for you is actually one that this conversation made me think about, and it's not here, so this was like something I was interested in. So one thing that I notice a lot that happens in academia is that we see, I was talking earlier about being an outsider, right? Or an observer watching in. So for example, I do my research in classrooms. So oftentimes you'll see me sitting at the back of the classrooms and observing. There's very little participation I do, right? But I'm still part of that community in the fact that I am a teacher and I was a K-12 teacher. So I do have some similar lived experiences to that. But we do see a lot in academia, people that do research on communities they've never been a part of.
Yep.
So what are your thoughts about that? Like, for example, one example I can give you in my field, I do a lot of work with multilingual students, right? And I'm a multilingual myself. I am bilingual, Spanish, English. But you might see people that are doing research when they might be monolingual, so they only know one language, or they might be going to schools, like for example, public schools when they went to private school all their life. They might have certain certain aspects of their identity that makes them an outsider to that community. So what are your thoughts about doing research like that? Because I think community-based participatory research is the complete opposite, right?
Yes, and also.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's funny that you're asking this question. So there's a line of Black feminist, Chicana, among other community of color thought, talking about either the insider-outsider dilemma. Patricia Hook calls it the outsider within, right? And so when you're talking about outsider,
yeah,
I talked to my colega Ivis Garcia about this because she's a Puerto Rican from Puerto Rico who had actually worked for Centro's notable Puerto Rican oral history project the year before I did. And we have an outline talking about how we're both insiders and outsiders in Puerto Rican Chicago.
Yeah.
And what I told her was, people react to you very differently than they react to me because you're blanquita and you're straight. And you are from Puerto Rico, which gives you a particular level of insiderness that que yo que me nací en Chicago y me crié en Chicago and went to boarding school, I am not. On the flip side, I was born in Chicago, and I was not born in a Puerto Rican neighborhood, which, in conversation with Marixa Licea, who's a sociologist who's written about Puerto Rican Chicago, Merida Rua, who's an anthropologist who's written about Puerto Rican Chicago, who are both from Chicago, they have an insider level that I don't, right? Which is why this is going to be a really juicy paper when I read it. Moving on. Now that I have time, I can do these things. And so when I think about non-Puerto Ricans doing Puerto Rican work, my next question is, because I've met them, right? Mm-hmm. And we've adopted them. Mm-hmm. Like, I've been to conferences where people call Laura Briggs an honorary Puerto Rican because of her phenomenal book, Reproducing Empire. And just this past October, I was able to tell her indirectly, because I was on a panel, I was like, I learned that my education was funded by a family who funded testing contraceptions on Puerto Rican women thanks to her book. And she was like, whoa. I was like, exactly, right? Mm-hmm. And who knows if I would have been anything more than a high school principal. I wasn't for high school and this situation, neo-colonial project. And so, right? And she earns it because she's critical of her privilege and her positioning, much like a handful of the other white folks who hang around Puerto Rican Chicago, because they're invested in the work, right? Mm-hmm. Oscar's brother, Jose Lopez, was working on his dissertation comparing the Irish nationalist movement to the Puerto Rican one, specifically wanting to look at, because he didn't finish, because he had an institution to run and then build. He was looking at Irish's anti-colonial movement against Britain in conversation with Campos, right? Mm-hmm. And I think I'm saying it right, because it's been a few years since I've been able to speak to Jose about it. And so for me, it's this question of ethics and investment. Because so often the walking in and out, I walk in and out because I couldn't get a job in Chicago or the East Coast, right? Mm-hmm. I went to grad school in Washington State because I saw all of my activist friends burnt out, overextended. And I knew that if I was working with Puerto Rican and Chicano and other Latino students across Chicago who wanted more Latino faculty, then it was also my responsibility to be part of the solution. Yeah. Right? And a handful of us are. There's me here. There's a Chicano somewhere in the Southeast. I forget the state because he was visiting in like one institution for a long time and now he's in another one. One of the other Bate Collective members, former Bate Collective members, teaches in Berkeley. And those are the ones I can keep track of because my sister works in the Bay and she's like, I just ran into Michael the other day. And I follow the Chicano on Facebook. And so, right, and so it's this question of insider, outsider, what is your goal? And in doing research in our communities, right? And this is a question I'm consistently asking the Chicanos, the indigenous, and the Black folks I work with here. What do you want me to do from this position? Because as a person of color, I'm an insider. As someone who wasn't born in Vegas, I'm an outsider, right? What is my responsibility? And now I'm learning, which I have to start explaining, right? I'm asking this because these are questions I asked home, and this is what home told me, and I know that home rules because Chicago has a strong, visible, vibrant civil rights history, with one of the longest standing Illinois reps being a Puerto Rican who advocated for immigrant rights, and has a Latino caucus in their city council that's been established for decades, and there's a Latino political bloc pipeline, and I know this because I interviewed a handful of them when I was working for Central, right? That's just beginning to develop here, and it looks very differently because this is a global tourist economy. So I need to know how you want to put my privilege to work, right? And some have no idea what to do because they've never been asked.
Well, I think it is very hard for scholars to think like that and to position themselves like that, right? And what I mean, sometimes it takes a lot of work to be able to position yourself and to understand in what different situations you might be an insider and in what others you are an outsider. And if you are an outsider, then what does that mean when you are either doing research or being part of a community? You have to acknowledge those things, right? And that's where I think a lot of people tend to not do, right? That acknowledgement of that, or knowing, right? For example, we both now have access, since we are both scholars and work at university, we have access to resources from an institution that a lot of other people who are not affiliated to a university don't. So it's just little things like that you don't realize that you do have a certain level of power and privilege within that community and that context.
Yeah, and for me, that power is a question of responsibility, right? Like, so the workload on top of my salary at UNLV is the reason I pushed back doing anything more than letting Oscar's letters stay in a drawer, right? Um, and in my visit to Arkansas, I wrote a 2-page outline of where I want the book to go, because in the way I was working and following Justin Favela and Berta Gutierrez in Family Fiesta, seeing Berta engage with her family in where they landed when they first came to the States, right? So she came back home, and seeing Justin exercise this ethos with local Latino business owners and their families, right, in terms of trying to affirm and uplift them, I was like, this creative practice is why I do research.
Yeah.
I'm also like, and I told him when I was there, I was like, and this is also why I stayed in Vegas, because even though we're in different arenas, even though, right, he's a full-time self-employed artist and everything that means, and I'm a nice salaried college professor, our ethics are complementary, right?
Yeah.
And he's not the only one. He's just the one I've written about most recently. And so I'm now in conversations with other local artists of color being like, so I've done a show, I've learned the ins and outs of fundraising, I'm reading all of these resources on museum studies. How can I share what I have access to with you? How can I use my position of privilege, right, to be at tables I need to be at, or to keep my mouth shut until there's rallying, so then we can make the interventions that need to be made. Because that's part of it. And I know that's part of it, not only because of my Oscar work, also because I worked with mixed status families. Right? There was a group of moms, so I took a year off between coursework and writing my dissertation because coming out was exhausting. And coursework was exhausting. And I like to say, I don't remember 2009, but I had 2 forthcoming peer-reviewed publications and a dissertation proposal. Okay, thanks, I guess. And so I come back home and I set the intention of like, I just want to be the first one at the job because I'm tired of being compared to people. And sure enough, I get hired for this job that literally says they want an expert in Mexican culture, and I know everything wrong with that statement. And they were like, you're not from here, what do you know? I was like, you're right, so put me to work. And so the same woman who said, you're not Mexican, you're not from Highland Park or Highwood, why are you working with us? Is the same person who said, you can't leave 8 months later. She's telling me teenagers are a little lazy, and I'm just sitting there and I was like, no, they're not. You just need to give them drive. And if you're going to tell me teenage boys who are tired and homesick don't want to mobilize folks to play more soccer, because they did, and they tripled that indoor soccer program within months. And they're like, when's the, and all they would text me Saturday night, when's the game? And I would have a schedule. And it was the hardest work, second hardest work I've ever had to leave. It was also like, I didn't have a master's degree. What was the other one? I didn't have a master's degree. I needed to finish my dissertation. And the nonprofit industrial complex is exhausting. And I was like, I need to be in the position where I can advocate for nonprofit professionals who have greater diplomacy skills than I do. Yeah. Which is what I'm trying to figure out right now since I've lived here 7+ years, right? And so this ethical concern, for me, it's this question of, and sometimes we can't afford to be there in terms of being part of community organizations because we're at Research One institutions, the writing demands are absurd, we have obstacles to overcome in writing, right? Just because we're in grad school, just because we have our PhDs, doesn't mean it's smooth sailing. Yeah. I'm English dominant and I still write in Spanglish. Not anymore because I've worked in, but I was. And so I don't want to be at an R1 institution because if I'm too busy doing research and I'm not connecting to the people I serve because I live there, or the people I serve because they're the reason I'm here, then I'm not doing my job. Having said that, there are some scholars who are like, my goal is to be successful because if I'm successful and I do this work and I gain these resources, then I can normalize people respecting us in these positions. Yeah. And neither of us are wrong. And I think at this point, right, and I'm talking about communities of color and other marginalized community scholars, we have to figure out whether we're at Harvard, Berkeley, or Nevada State, how we all want the same thing and we're going about it in very different positions.
Ways. Yeah, that's true. And I think for us specifically, like, It is important to have those collaborations with other people and other institutions because we're all trying to achieve, not all, but like some of us have similar goals, but we can't go about it the same way, right? Like you mentioned, I think that really speaks to the way that academia is, and also to a lot of misconceptions that there is about academia and what that entails. But that's a different podcast. Like when we talk about, like, I think what a lot of people assume professors are doing and everything, it's very different than reality versus what we are actually doing and engaging in. But I wanted to, going back to community-based participatory research, what are some of the challenges that artists of color are facing? Like, for example, I know that all challenges, I'm sure they're very different, but what are some of those challenges and what can communities do to support artists of color?
So much like what artists of color and PhDs of color have in common is that they're both operating in white dominant spaces.
Yeah.
And that unless they get a full-time job, it's feast and famine, right? Because I was underemployed for 4 years. Post PhD, I worked at a call center, which allowed me to do the community garden thing and helping immigrant women organize at a food pantry, right? And then I was youth counselor for a caddy program, working with femmes of color, field director for a school choice campaign. Then I worked for Centro. I say all of this to say, in thinking about your question, what we have in common is that we're navigating spaces where we're not supposed to exist. An artist of color, much like a scholar of color, can be critiqued and celebrated for the kind of research they do, right? In early conversations with Justin Favela, and he talks about this with his book, when they hire a Latino artist, right, there's an expectation they have. Fluffy Iglesias talks about it in one of his specials where they literally told him, without telling him, they wanted him to be more spicy in terms of a voice he did for a cartoon. Artists of color do the same thing, like in visual artists of color, because actors are artists, right, do the same thing, right? I've had colleagues who are told not to write about their communities because it won't get them a job. At the same time, there are scholars, regardless of discipline, who are expected to write about their communities and who don't want to. One of the podcasts I followed early on was an Asian American literary scholar and a Black woman scientist, STEM scholar, who created the podcast PH Divas. And the reason they came together is because they weren't supposed to exist, right? In terms of they weren't doing identity-based work, right? They were making critical interventions in their fields as one of a few. And so with artists of color, right, like I've worked with artists who want to be like, I want to do art for my community and I want my artistic practice to be separate from my community. And sometimes they don't get that choice. I've met artists who are stuck in particular mediums because that's what they're consistently hired to do. And so the intention behind it has lost its value. And at the same time, it's their bread and butter, so they have to continue doing the thing. Or artists who have to decide whether or not they're gonna pay rent or take a risk and apply for this grant and hope it works out. And someone was telling me it's a feast or famine cycle. And what it takes to make it isn't just making good stuff. It's about building the right relationships. It's about, in often cases, and I saw this when I was a curator, tolerating specific kinds of behavior. Because it's not just that museum directors are mostly white women or collections are mostly white. And you can see the stats. Journalists are mostly white. Art critics are mostly white. Art scholars are mostly white, correct? And so donors are mostly white, correct? And so like there's this expectation of living and working in a culture where you're trying to make inroads, trying to speak truth to power while also keeping your job. And one of the bittersweet and beautiful things I experienced this year to this point is I gave a webinar for my alma mater and I forgot, even though I was with my white friends protesting Coke as a senior, facing concerns and backlash, right? Like, and then a group of folks didn't like what I had to say. published about it. Fox News picked it up. Fox News, the TV channel, texted me on my phone, and I'm like, I'm a student of political prisoners and civil rights activists. Nuh-uh, I know what this means. I gotta change my number, right? Yeah. And what was beautiful in that moment is I wasn't representing the institution, because that is not our job. That is not what we do. And I had colleagues at Nevada State who were reading hate mail with me, who were figuring out plan B and C's for my safety. And that meant the world to me, because in this current political moment, speaking truth to power, right, with these anti-critical race theory legislation, with the banning of books, right, this like McCarthy level nonsense, McCarthyism rather, I was supported and affirmed by my colleagues. So everyone's stressing out, and all I think is, no, this is awesome, because I know that I work at the right institution, because my senior colleagues and my administrators are worried about my emotional well-being and respect my academic freedom. Yeah. Regardless of whether or not they agree, right? They support my First Amendment rights. And that institutional support doesn't come everywhere. Yeah. And part of it, right, is that the arts are, I mean, if education is underfunded, don't even think about the arts in terms of funding. Yeah. Right? And if we take away the creative political interventions, here you have entrepreneurs who are paid for their final product without attention to the hours it takes to make that work. And so when someone tells me, like, their careers, the toll of the work is a first world problem, all I think is, I work a 40-hour work week. I don't believe success is a first world problem if, one, you're isolated, if, two, on top of being isolated, right, people aren't reading enough about you to interview you correctly. That's not, like when I wrote a catalog for the Awani exhibit, which was the first documented indigenous-centric exhibit to take place at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, Justin said, you read everything you can find about the artist before you ask them any questions. I was like, yes, boss. Right? And then I told Fawn Douglas, who was a graduate student who organized it, I said, this is a syllabus. I'm not going to build it yet, but this is a syllabus, Fawn. And I say that because, right, like, it's important. I say first documented because I don't know if there was one before, because earlier museum leadership and gallery leadership didn't document a lot of things. And so there I'm asking, like, are you going to archive all of this? They're like, that's a really good idea. I was like, yes, because 20 years from now, when there's another Nuvuvi student who wants to be an artist, who wants to know if this has been done before, there's evidence. Yeah. Because that evidence of we were here, we can't be erased, and we did dope shit is absolutely necessary. Especially if and when there are states and institutions who don't value our histories of brilliance and struggle and determination enough to let people know that we existed. I was just talking to a friend filmmaker today about how these young students are showing her film, and we were having the same conversation about, like, regardless of her experience of that film, she wants younger folks to know they're not the first ones. And for me, going back to why I became a college professor in the first place, to be drinking Cubano Cafe, right, down the street, down the hall from one of the leading Puerto Rican, Latina, lesbian sociolinguists and queer studies scholar, right, as Anita Castillo is walking into the office, you can't make that stuff up. That's like cultural wealth and cachet that, like, when I see students and they hug me and we're literally talking Spanglish in class, that's why I do what I do, because I get to pay it forward. And I'm so glad I'm in a minority serving institution doing it, because when I show up with my mom, or when I show up, because my sister and my brother came to visit me once, right? When I show up, right, and I have twin PhDs, because my sister also has her PhD, I know what I'm telling my students. Yeah. Que sí se puede porque lo hicimos. Yeah. Lo hicimos antes que yo, lo hicimos antes que nosotras, and we can do it again. Now the difference is, I'm like, let's talk about economy, prestige, and where people go to school so they can get hired in particular institutions, because now I know those invisible rules, right? That I also now see, coming back to your original question, artists of color sharing with each other. And one of the beautiful things that I'm, like, spoiled with is that I consistently see artists of color like Justin translating what he's learning about the institutions to other artists. I'm seeing, like, artists like Fawn build like BIPOC art spaces. I'm starting to work with folks in left to center gallery, right? Because Black and brown people are building institutions to celebrate what we do. And it's difficult, and there's lots of fundraising involved, and maybe some patience, right? And I know that we can, and I know that they can, and I feel fortunate and privileged enough that they allow me to be part of the conversation, because that's where I came and stayed in the first place.
Okay, that is super interesting. And when you're saying that, it makes me think about this. So this is very well known, but we know that for a lot of, you were talking about how artists of color and museums have to start doing like collections of their work, right? That was one of the things that you were mentioning. You were mentioning
that they need to diversify their collections.
They need to diversify their collections. What I think is super important to also think about where those diverse collections are being held, because it's also very criticized when you're seeing art collections of, for example, other communities in other museums. And what I mean by this, for example, like British museums have been very...
Oh, the colonial pillaging.
Yeah, exactly. The colonial... That's the term. I didn't know that was a term. The colonial... So how do we avoid that? Because you were mentioning, like, we need to start doing these collections, but how do we avoid falling into that pattern?
It's contemporary, right? And it's also consent. So the centuries old items that have been pillaged and taken, right? As you're asking me this question, I'm thinking about, I've been following Hyperallergic coverage of how countries, activists are holding museums accountable to these processes. Not just the contemporary one. Like, there's this really powerful movement taking place with the Philadelphia Museum. And this is a recent project that I don't know the specifics of. A Philadelphia Museum that has scholars and community members holding the museum accountable for holding decades-old remains of people. You have indigenous communities holding higher ed institutions and other museums accountable for holding the remains of their ancestors who have passed, right?
Yeah.
And so there is this talk back and this pushback. Now, having said that, some institutions can be held responsible, and I hate saying this because this is really messed up, and have the resources to return them. And some institutions don't.
No, I mean, I think most don't, because that's what brings people in, right? Like, I remember last time that I went to Europe, I went to a lot of museums, and some of these museums, it was like walking into the pyramids of Egypt. I'm like, but I'm in Germany.
Yeah.
And I'm like, this is very interesting. I mean, it's fascinating. That's what brings people into those museums, right? But it isn't necessarily their story to be told, and giving back, right? Like, I think we can do we definitely can do more progress, and I think progress has been done as to how we
still need work.
We still need work, because I don't think, for example, Native American artifacts are going to be returned to their communities. Or are they being returned?
I can do you one better. What if they're not marked for where they came from? Because I know one of the reasons I work with the barrack is because on first walking in after the 1 October shooting, Alicia had said the collection is too white and too male, and I was like, okay, we're of the same mind. I don't have to school you. This is great. Right? Is that when they were trying to catalog things they had, because the UNLV Marjorie Barrack Museum of Art used to be a history museum, there were some items they didn't know how or where to return because they weren't cataloged in that way. So when I say it's a question of resources, it may be that at a certain point, no one cared to document where things were from, and there's no grant funding to fund someone to figure that out. So that's part of it. The other part of it is in terms of returning, and this is me saying it should be returned and also unpacked and all the things, right? Is if you return them home, does home have the resources to preserve them? On a spiritual level, right? Because part of the reason you're walking into Egypt, and part of the spiritual and emotional concern is, why are we digging up the dead?
Yeah.
Why are we disturbing people for whom various communities across the world, disturbing the dead is sacrilegious?
Yeah.
And so how are we healing those generations of wounds, right? On top of that, the other question that's been emerging, especialmente when I think about, there's a scholar, Eve Tuck, that, and Marcela Rodriguez, our colleague who works for the Center of Equity and Diversity, introduced me to her, or reminded me of her. I can't remember, my head explodes. But Marcela gave me an article where Eve Tuck is talking about there are some things too sacred to write about.
Yeah.
And
but those are very blurred lines, right? Like, and what I think about that is, for some people, I think that becomes, like, for example, because you said, why are we digging up the dead, or why are we visiting or doing these things? For me, I can totally see, for example, going to an Egyptian pyramid to see that, right? But I could never, and this is gonna sound like, I think it's a pretty similar analogy, but we just recently lost 5 people, I think, going down to the Titanic, where in my mind I'm like, why would someone want to go to a gravesite, right? But we all compartmentalize those things differently, which makes it it just makes it kind of blurry how we approach this.
It is, and it's great, because it's one of those things where I can see the wonder and the fascination for what the Titanic represents, right?
Yeah.
Because there are scholars who write about the 20th century as the American century, because post-Manifest Destiny, that took what is now the United States into Puerto Rico and Guam and the American Samoa and the Philippines and Guantanamo Bay, right? It was luxury and excess, and and there's something that gives to people. I'm not that person.
Yeah.
And at the same time, we compartmentalize it because of when a human's value stops and starts, or ends and begins. And like, I was driving and I saw this thing that said faith, this bumper sticker that said faith, family, and freedom. I was like, which faith, which families, and which freedoms?
Yeah.
And I think about this in conversation with the historical preservation of artifacts, not mine or belonging to somebody else, because it's, when we dig something up, what are we thinking about? I curated an art show around personal family photos. I used a photo from my mother, my first day at Deerfield, as both marketing and the pamphlet. One, because I want to say a divorced mom produced 2 PhDs, you're welcome, Latino community. Not you're welcome, Latino community, but like, si se puede, right? But I also did it because I understood that every artist who said yes to a first-time curator who has never been trained, I took it upon myself to exercise the personal responsibility of being as vulnerable. And so, what is it? 2 years after my grandmother passed, I'm using one of the oldest photos of her and having conversations with my family about, I'm going to do this show. Can we please send me the one? Like, can you really just please send me a picture and we'll figure out how to redigitize it, right? Like, there were some emails. And they said yes. And so, right? But I'm also doing it as a way to commemorate my grandmother, honor my grandmother, who was the Catholic who told my Catholic mom, yes, send your daughters 1,000 miles away from home, which is huge, because we don't send our kids away from home unless we absolutely have to. And this was a privilege. And and I look back at my grandmother's legacy, and I was like, you wanted me to be more independent than you could ever be.
Yeah.
And so, however I feel about some of the choices you made, at the end of the day, you loved me the best way you knew how.
Yeah.
And I think about that in conversation with sharing her, because for some people, I literally had someone say, I didn't understand your show until you opened it. And I was like, because the show wasn't about you. It was about honoring what it meant for me to feel safe enough to stay.
Yeah.
After I've been through some stuff, while also acknowledging the fact that I have a freedom and a capacity to love and share because of this woman who sacrificed so much, right? So we could be here, and so I could exist the way that I do.
Yeah.
My mother, well, women, because my mother too, right? And so that doesn't always translate for people. It translated for everyone, for like 99% of the people who filled out the cards, and all of my friends and the community, and the couple of community organizations I personally toured, but it doesn't translate to everyone.
Yeah.
And I also did it because the show was an extension of my mother's and daughter's class, which was the first time my mother explicitly participated with my students in 2017. It was also a way to close the loop of my UNLV career, because my first year at UNLV, I taught my mothers and daughters class. My mom came to visit and was telling students that either my sister or me said, in preschool we were 3, that she couldn't have been our mother, that someone told us she couldn't have been our mother because she was white, while at the same time acknowledging I grew a lot at UNLV so that I can teach at Nevada State and continue to serve the community at a teaching-centered institution where I made the most sense. Because I didn't have access to my history. I dedicated decades to discovering and preserving and collaborating with folks to preserve it as it was being made. And yet, for some people, that's just a black and white photo.
Yeah.
Or that's something that they're so excited about without recognizing the vulnerability and the risk that I exercised in sharing my grandmother with you, who is the second most important woman in my life.
Yeah. Yeah.
And people don't think about that when they're thinking about digging up sarcophagi or old pots and pans from their resting places.
Yeah.
That you're digging up people's lives and hearts and spirits in ways that we need to be more mindful of.
And I think that's why a lot of times we see so much division. For example, when they're trying to build a pipeline that just happens to go through a native burial, and that becomes, and some people are like, I don't understand. What's the big issue? What's the big problem? For some people, it's like, it's your history, right? That you're digging up and destroying. And it really becomes it's personal, it's lineage, it's generations. There's a reason why we talked about generational trauma. There's a reason why we talk about, like, you might have not met this person in real life, but they still have an impact on who you are today.
Yeah.
And it's something that I don't think we really stop to think about that impact that past generations have had on us, and how you are and who you are is because of the work they did, right? And the work that we're doing now will impact many, many generations to come. So that is super interesting. Okay, so I have one last question for you.
Okay.
And, two, actually. The last question I have has to do with what are some ways that the community can engage and support community-based action research?
Tell us the stories you want us to tell.
Okay.
And what I mean by that is, right, like, how do you want me to write about you? Or, right, or, and if I'm thinking about this locally, and I'm thinking about this locally because people aren't looking at Las Vegas artists enough, I feel better, or Latino community organizations enough. It's like, this is who I am, this is how I exist, how can I work with you?
Yeah.
And so, and that question is also particular. It's particular to region in terms of the organizations and the community leaders, right, that are there, and the community networks that are there, because not everyone wants to build a nonprofit, which I'm learning, and I understand, right? It's also depends on the institution, right? Some institutions have a horrible history in that community and have no desire to rectify it. Thank you, Supreme Court and Harvard. Am I done? Nope. And so we have to think about what are your goals, right? And what is possible. The joy I have in working at a public institution is that part of the public institution's mission is that we have to serve our community.
Yeah.
And so the question becomes how, right? And what does the institution value, and what does it not? And what are the ethical parameters? And what are the financial ones?
Yeah.
Because as much as I love working at a public institution, we're also dealing with public funding. We don't have endowments. On top of the fact we just turned 20. We're going to be 21 in a few months.
Yeah.
So there's a bit we can't do yet.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so like when I'm talking to a community leader and she's like, do you have grants? And I was like, not a lot of institutional ones because I'm a public institution, but if we find private ones, we can figure out how to work together.
Yeah.
Right? And as I'm having that conversation, I'm like, and we're going to take our time because I'm not going anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And you got a lot of stuff to do, and I got a lot of stuff to do because now I got time. Right? I do. But I'm also pacing everything I have to do so I can build the relationships so that any community interventions I build with people, I center the with instead of the building.
Yeah.
Like some folks who've known me for years, I say, I have 3 questions. What are your priorities? How do you want me to deal with your stakeholders?
Mm-hmm.
Which means, right, what can and can I not say? And then, what's the other one? If we are to collaborate, know that your humanity comes first.
Mm-hmm.
And if I hear someone says, I need more time for this, I was like, okay, so every time I check in with you, I'm going to ask you about those two things. And they're like, what? And I was like, these are your priorities. I want to work with you, and for a working relationship to work, you need to know that your humanity comes before the work. Because the rest of the world wants to tell us that that's not true. And thinking about working through losing my grandmother, radiation, and everything I worked through in 2020. And then also thinking through like what some of the artists went through during just the season of my show. Artists don't get breaks.
Yeah.
They don't get FMLA like we do.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Not all organizers get FMLA like we do. And we live in a healthcare desert. That's a physical healthcare desert and a mental healthcare desert, right?
Yeah.
So what are the things we can do to make sure you're okay and that I'm okay?
Yeah.
And the joys of being in a teaching institution is that I write because I want to. I don't write for my job. I write to support and uplift and collaborate with the people who choose to collaborate and trust me with their stories.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you're asking me what folks can do to support community-based participatory research, I'm thinking about what's at stake for organizations and being written about, what's at stake for community leaders and social and political and creative and professional networks of marginalized communities at writing about them, right?
Mm-hmm.
And how do we, as people who observe them, take our observations and share it with them first before we publish them, so that, not that we're writing what they want us to write, however, so that they have a chance to address concerns and limitations. So if we decide to write about them and publish them, they're not blind. I'm trying not to use. They're not caught unawares, and they're not put in a very difficult ethical position that can reflect on who donates to them and who hires them and who fundraises for them.
Mm-hmm.
You know, one of the things, like, as I was curating and as I do anything I do, I'm not in the work and I'm not interested in taking someone's story and not caring about the 5 to next steps of repercussion.
Yeah.
And when I was thinking about doing this interview, I was like, is there going to be a chance to talk about Me Too or not? I was like, yes. And I integrated that into this conversation because for me, as a survivor, I know what it's like, and as a person who came out, I know what it's like for people to take my stories and run with it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to do that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like finally at peace with how people responded to my willingness to like be an agent of my healing and thinking I wasn't good enough for stuff because of it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to do that to other people.
Mm-hmm.
Me Too survivor or not, right? And so all of this being said, I'm consistently thinking about ethics. I'm consistently thinking about consent in everything I do. Because we can't control economics, but we can do our best to treat each other with compassion, integrity, and respect.
That's true. That's very true. So before we finish this episode of Sip and Scholar, let's do a cheers.
Mm-hmm.
Cheers!
Cheers!
Yay! And what is the best way that our listeners can reach you? If they have any questions or they would like to get in contact with you.
I'm trying to figure out because I'm like on a social
social
media hiatus because hate mail was scary. So you can follow me on Twitter at prof_Abad. And I think I'm okay with Instagram. And you can follow me on prof_Abad on Instagram too. You can also reach me through the Nevada State website,
Okay.
which is the best way. Because I'm reluctant to take on new followers on Instagram because I don't know what you're about.
Yeah.
And hate mail was scary. But Twitter and work email are the best way to follow me.
Awesome. Well, you heard it. I'll put your information on the discussion, the information box below so that they can reach out to you or to the Nevada State website. Thank you so much for everything. I really appreciate you taking the time to be here.
Yeah, this was fun.
Yay! Well, we're going to see each other at trivia in a couple hours.
Yep.
Bye.